Imagine being told to walk the length of a marathon, fully armed, carrying 60 pounds of gear, and then do it again tomorrow. And the day after that. Every single day. For decades. That was Tuesday for a Roman soldier. No rest days. No excuses. No exceptions. And here's the strangest part, the soldiers who did this weren't just surviving. They were the most feared military force the ancient world had ever seen. The very act of marching wasn't wearing them down. It was building something. Something the enemies of Rome couldn't understand and couldn't stop. So what exactly was happening on those roads? Why did Rome demand this kind of punishment from its own men, day after day, mile after mile? The answer isn't just about fitness. It's about control, psychology, engineering, and a military system so sophisticated that modern armies still study it today. Let's go back to the beginning. Picture yourself standing outside a Roman military camp in 50 BC. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. The air is cold. Around you, thousands of men are already moving. Not stumbling out of tents half awake. Moving. With purpose. With precision. Sandals lacing up, shields being strapped, packs being loaded in the exact same order they were loaded yesterday. By the time the light breaks over the hills, the entire legion, sometimes 10,000 men, is already on the road. They are not running. They are not rushing. They're marching at a pace so steady and deliberate it almost looks slow. But do the math and something incredible emerges. At that pace, maintained without breaking, a Roman legion could cover 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 to 20 modern miles, before midday. Before midday. And after that march? They didn't collapse into sleep. They built a camp. A full fortified camp with walls, ditches, organized tent rows, and defensive positions. Every single night. In unfamiliar territory. In enemy lands. This was the Roman machine. And it ran on feet. To understand why Rome demanded this from its soldiers, you need to understand what Rome was actually trying to build. Not just an army. A system. A repeatable, scalable, predictable system that could function in the deserts of North Africa, the forests of Germany, and the mountains of Judea, all at the same time. Speed was the foundation of that system. The Roman Empire at its height stretched over 5 million square kilometers. Rebellions could erupt anywhere. Invasions could come from any direction. If Rome's legions moved slowly, they were always reacting, always behind, always scrambling. But if the legions could move with terrifying speed, faster than any enemy expected, Rome could arrive before the enemy was ready. Before they had allies. Before they had a plan. The march wasn't punishment. It was a weapon. And Rome had engineered it down to a science. Here's how it actually worked. The standard Roman march was called the ita justum, the ordinary march. 20 Roman miles, or roughly 29 kilometers. It was the baseline. The minimum. Accomplished in about 5 hours at a regulated pace. But when urgency demanded it, legions switched to what was called the ita magnum, the Great March. 24 Roman miles. Done faster, with fewer breaks. And when Rome was truly in crisis. When a general needed to be somewhere yesterday. There was a third mode. Historians called it the forced march. Soldiers pushed through pain, through fatigue, through darkness if necessary, covering distances that left enemy scouts in disbelief. Julius Caesar was famous for this. His legions would appear in places his enemies thought were days away. They thought Caesar had some kind of supernatural speed. He didn't. He had trained men and ruthless discipline. But here's the critical detail most people miss. The marching pace wasn't set by how fast the men could go. It was set by how long they could sustain it. Roman military theory understood something that modern sports science confirms: aerobic endurance degrades if you spike the effort too early. The regulated Roman pace was calculated to keep soldiers functional at the destination, not just alive. They arrived ready to fight. Ready to build. ready to operate. That's not instinct. That's engineering. Now let's talk about what these men were actually carrying. A Roman legionary on the march carried what soldiers and historians have nicknamed Marius's mule, named after the general Gaius Marius who standardized the load around 107 BC. Before Marius, soldiers relied on a long supply train of carts, mules, and servants. The column moved at the speed of its heaviest wagon on its worst road. It was slow. It was vulnerable. And it made the legion predictable. Marius changed everything. He stripped the supply train and moved the load onto the soldiers themselves. What did that? Now let's talk about what these men were actually carrying. A Roman legionary on the march carried what soldiers and historians have nicknamed Marius's mule, named after the general Gaius Marius who standardized the load around 107 BC. Before Marius, soldiers relied on a long supply train of carts, mules, and servants. The column moved at the speed of its heaviest wagon on its worst road. It was slow. It was vulnerable. And it made the legion predictable. Marius changed everything. He stripped the supply train and moved the load onto the soldiers themselves. What did that load look like? Picture this. A legionary carried his pilum, the heavy-throwing javelin. His gladius, the short sword strapped to his side. A scutum, the famous rectangular shield, alone weighing around 10 kilograms. Body armor, either chainmail or segmented plate. A helmet. A dolabra, a combination pickaxe and hoe for digging the camp. A saw. A wicker basket for moving earth. Cooking equipment. Rations for up to 2 weeks, sometimes more. Personal items, clothing, a leather sack. The total load? Depending on the campaign, estimates range from 35 to 45 kilograms. Some historians put it as high as 50. That's roughly 90 to 100 pounds on your back. Now add sandals. Roman military sandals, caligae, had thick leather soles studded with iron hobnails. Functional. Durable. But unforgiving on long paved roads. After enough miles, every step sent a small shock up through your legs. Now do 20 miles. And this is where we have to stop for a moment and think about what this actually felt like. You are 19 years old. You signed up for a 25-year military career. You have been in the Legion for 3 months. Your body has been reshaped by daily drilling, weapons training, and yes, marching. But your shoulders still ache from the pack. Your feet have blisters that have become calluses that have started blistering again. Your neck is stiff from the helmet. The man in front of you sets the pace. You match it. You don't fall behind. Falling behind is noticed. Falling behind is remembered. Around hour 3, your lower back starts to burn. Not ache, burn. The pack rides on a forked pole called a furca, like a yoke over your shoulder, which distributes some weight but not enough. After 2 hours, no amount of adjustment helps. You don't stop. You don't complain. Not because you're superhuman, but because every man around you is carrying the same weight, feeling the same burn, and not stopping either. The collective silence becomes its own strange fuel. Then, around mile 16, something shifts. The burning fades into a kind of numbness. Experienced soldiers knew this feeling. They called it nothing because it had no name. It was simply what the body did when it decided to survive. You reach the campsite and the real work begins. Because the march was only half the daily requirement. After covering 20 miles, a Roman legion didn't simply pitch tents and sleep. They built a castra, a fortified camp, from scratch. Every single night. The dimensions were standardized. The layout never changed. The moment a sentry reached its assigned position, the men knew exactly where to dig, what to dig, and how deep. Ditches came first, a V-shaped trench roughly 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide surrounding the entire perimeter. The excavated earth was piled inward to form a rampart. Sharpened wooden stakes, the men carried segments of these, were set into the rampart wall. Inside, organized rows of tents. Command positions. Supply areas. Latrines in designated corners. Everything positioned identically to the camp from the night before, and the night before that. An entire fortified position. Built in 3 hours. By men who had just marched 20 miles. Why? Because an undefended camp was a death trap. In enemy territory, a surprise night attack on a sleeping, unprotected army had ended more campaigns than any pitched battle. Rome refused to accept that vulnerability. So they eliminated it every single night, with labor. The camp was also psychological. When an enemy army scouts reported that the Roman camp appeared overnight, fully formed, fully defended, walls and ditches and organized, it sent a message without a word being spoken. These people do not get tired. These people do not make mistakes. Run. Now let's talk about what happened when the system broke down. Rome did not forgive failure in its legions. The consequences for undermining military discipline were designed to be unforgettable. A soldier who fell out of the march without legitimate cause faced flogging. Public, in front of the century. The humiliation was considered as important as the physical punishment. Sleeping on guard duty was a capital offense. No exceptions. A soldier who dozed off at his post could be beaten to death by his own tent mates, the men whose lives his negligence endangered. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a deliberate system of collective accountability. Your failure doesn't just cost you. It costs everyone around you. The most feared punishment in the entire Roman military had a name: decimation. If a unit broke formation in battle, mutinied, or committed mass cowardice, 1 in every 10 men was selected by lot and beaten to death by the other 9. It happened rarely, precisely because the threat of it never left the back of every soldier's mind. The surviving men were then forced to sleep outside the camp's defensive walls, in enemy territory, on reduced rations. Until they proved themselves again. There was no appeal. No review board. The legion was not a democracy. It was a machine, and machines that malfunction get repaired, or replaced. But here's the thing about that machine. It also rewarded. Veterans who served there 25 years received land grants, real land, often in conquered territories. Roman citizenship if they didn't already have it. A pension. Respect that lasted a lifetime. In a world where most people were born poor and died poor, military service was one of the only reliable ladders upward. So soldiers endured the marching not just out of fear. They endured it because they understood the deal. Survive the machine. Become part of what the machine built. And what it built was the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. To understand how extraordinary this was, consider who Rome was competing with. The Gauls were fierce individual warriors. Enormous, terrifying, screaming into battle with abandon. But without formation, without discipline, without the ability to sustain operations across weeks and months, they were devastating in the first charge and helpless when it failed. The Parthians were brilliant cavalry archers. They could outmaneuver Roman formations in open desert. But they couldn't hold territory. They couldn't besiege a city. They couldn't march in rain. The Germanic tribes were relentless and fearless. But their armies were essentially raiders, large, fast, and impossible to sustain in the field for long periods without constant pillaging. Every enemy Rome faced was optimized for one thing. One terrain. One kind of fight. The Roman legion was optimized for everything. It could function on any terrain, in any weather, against any enemy, because the daily march trained adaptability into the body itself. The men who marched 20 miles through rain in Britain also marched 20 miles through sand in Egypt. The conditions changed. The pace stayed the same. That universality was unprecedented in the ancient world. And almost nothing like it existed again until the rise of professional standing armies in early modern Europe, roughly 1500 years later. So why did Roman soldiers march 20 miles every day? Not because Rome was cruel, though it could be. Not because generals wanted to exhaust their men, though the marching did exhaust them. not because of tradition, though tradition reinforced it. They marched because movement was survival. Speed was the empire's immune system, the ability to respond to threats faster than threats could organize. And that speed couldn't be summoned in a crisis. It had to be built into the body over months and years until it was automatic. Until 20 miles felt like a normal Tuesday. They marched because the camp they built at the end of each march kept them alive. The discipline required to build that camp every single night kept them sharp. Kept them from making the small lazy decisions that get soldiers killed. They marched because the march itself, the shared suffering, the identical pace, the collective load, created something you cannot manufacture any other way. Unit cohesion. The deep, bone-level trust that the man beside you has been tested the same way you have. That he won't break. That when the line holds, he holds. The march wasn't preparation for the Roman military machine. The march was the machine. Every mile of road, every blister, every camp dug in hostile soil, it was all part of a single, elegant, relentless system designed to turn ordinary men into something Rome's enemies mistook for gods. Here's what I want you to sit with. We live in an age that talks endlessly about discipline, about building habits, about doing hard things consistently. We buy apps for it. We read books about it. We listen to podcasts about it. Roman soldiers didn't talk about discipline. They just marched. So here's my question for you. What would it look like to apply that kind of relentless, unsexy, daily consistency to whatever you are actually trying to build? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read them. And if this kind of deep dive into the hidden systems behind history's greatest civilizations is what you're here for, next time, we're going inside the Roman castra itself. How a temporary camp built in 3 hours became one of the most sophisticated military installations in the ancient world. And how that single design decision helped Rome conquer a continent. See you there.